Let's talk about how we describe verbal communication. All right, so one of the ways that we describe it is that it is largely symbolic. So that just means that the words that we come up with are standing in for the object. Now, there's nothing that's inherent in anything that we pick up that makes us think about it in a particular way. When even something as simple as a book, when we first came up with the word book, that was random. It wasn't something that inherently we're looking at it and we're going, hey, you know what this should be called? Book. That's why there's so many different words for it in different languages. It's because there's nothing inherent in the actual object itself. It's just the way that we try to symbolize it to make shorthands for ourselves and to communicate with other people so we could both picture the same thing in our head without having the object directly in front of us and simply pointing. So our language is symbolic. And when you're thinking about that, you think about how our language has developed over time, that sometimes we have these really new words that seem to come out of nowhere. And then we have words that, develop based on words that are already in our language system. And so when you think of something like, oh, that has Latin roots, that has Greek roots, we still develop words based on our system that's already been built for us, that's symbolic. But we also sometimes come up with random words and we give it meaning even today. So thinking about that in our society. Now, our language is also rule governed. So there's constitutive and there's regulative rules. So the constitutive rules are things like this is going to constitute this word. So this object that I'm thinking about is going to be symbolically represented by this word. And then there's regulative rules. And so there's a lot of rules in our language, and these are the most difficult for second language speakers to pick up on. And when you're learning another language, this is going to be some of the hardest ones for you to pick up on because you can know the actual words, but you may not know the grammar rule, the language rule that it follows. So one of these things may be that one rule that we all seem to follow in English that is interesting that you may not even know about is that when we describe things, we actually have a rank order for how we describe it. So we usually say opinion, then size, then age, then shape, then color, then origin, then material, and purpose. So it would sound really natural to say the big red ball. But when you say the red big ball, it sounds a little off. And so you're like, I wonder why that is. And that's one of those weird regulative rules that we have in our language system that we're not even naturally aware of because you grow up speaking the language or you just pick it up over time. Language is also flexible. So, depending on your relationship with somebody, your language rules can change. So, this can be things like the formality of your language, but also the language that you actually use with certain people. So, for instance, you may have nicknames. And in Spanish, we talk about this a lot that sometimes you can have things like a nickname of gordita. And somebody would be like, wow, that sounds offensive. Or like, why are you talking about the person's weight? But really, it's a term of endearment. A lot of times when people go, oh, my little gordita, they're not going, oh my gosh, so embarrassing. We're trying to point this out or fat shaming somebody. It's literally with like all the love in their heart. They're giving that nickname to somebody else. And so it's flexible based on your relationship with that person. You can also think about it as in group, out groupers for who uses certain terminology. So in the queer community, you may use a different terminology that you might find straight people using it kind of feels weird. And the same thing with different races, different cultures. There may be certain words that are off limits for those that are outside of the group and certain language that you use within your group. So that's also how you can think about this flexibility working. It's also cultural, so this kind of blends right in. But every culture kind of decides on the language that's appropriate in the culture. It develops, so you can think of this as not only around the world, but also generationally, what language to use that your parents maybe don't use. So this can be slang. It can also be just very different regions. So think about the different regions that you are, even within a country, and how much that actually can indicate to somebody, hey, we might think the same because we use the same language, we use the same slang. And so thinking about that of how much does it bond you to use certain language? How can you tell if somebody's of a different generation than you just simply by the slang that they use? And so these can all be things that you think about of how do we bond with people culturally through our language? And then also, how do we exclude people through our language? And so how can we be more inclusive in society? All things to think about. Also, language evolves over time. So language changes. There's a bunch of new words added to the dictionary all the time. One of the things that I like to think about is it's very hard to actually think of movements, think against the grain if you don't have a word for things. So when you think about it, racism wasn't even a word in common vernacular until the 1930s. But you sure can bet that there was racism before the 1930s. So, what does that mean? That means that we are able to think about it so differently now that we have the word for these things. So, think about what language is developing right now and how does it help us constitute the world? How does it help us think about things differently? And what language would you add? All right, so these are all the ways that we think about language. I hope that this gives you a new perspective and something to think about.